Hey, welcome back to Business 150, Introduction to Management. This is now module number 2 as we begin to look at content from chapter 2 in the textbook. And this particular chapter looks at the historical thought and the evolution of management thinking. And so what we want to look at in this very first video, as you can see from the title slide, why theory and history? Why should we consider theory and history? Isn't theory and history just a bunch of old guys talking about old stuff in old conversations? And what does it have to do with us today? Well, this actually is a question that really we should answer for not only this class, but for every class you take in college or a university. Why would we want to study old, musty, parochial theory and history? Why look in the past? Well, let me see if I can offer you a couple of considerations. When you finish this video, we hope that you will be able to explain why studying theory and history is important and important to the actual practice of management. And in addition, you should be able to trace some of the early major thought on management that good people, good women and men have thought and published and considered as we've thought about this very big topic of managing organizations. So the first thing I would suggest to you, a very famous quote, I think it originates with George Santayana, the author and writer: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." You can see the quote there. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It is a very, very true fact that we as humans learn from studying what other humans have done and decided and chosen and experienced in the past. And of course, you know this from your own experience, right? We don't really, as human beings, learn from experience. We learn from thinking and reflecting upon our experience. And there are great lessons to learn there, great things that we can use to avoid making the same mistake again. Well, that's one reason why studying history and theory is important. And as you can see, the second bullet point, professional humility, or what I would use that term to describe, is the fact that we as people, we as women and men thinking about how to manage organizations, we should exercise a healthy degree of humility to be able to readily admit we are not the first people to hit this beach. We're not the first people to ever consider some of these thoughts about, wait a minute, this organization, couldn't it be managed better? Doesn't the way that we manage our resources and our processes, couldn't we have higher performance? And in fact, there are many folks who have thought and considered and studied, and we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. I think it's very, very good posture for us throughout our careers to have enough humility, a measure of humility to admit we're not the first person to ever have a brilliant thought, and we can certainly learn from smart people who have come before us. Now, there is a third consideration that I'd like you to consider. You can see it there in the third bullet point. The theories and the analogs and the frameworks that we use to study a subject will shape our thinking. And you can see here the bullet point there, right? That the mind is a computer, or is it that the heart is a restless factory, or what is it? Is an organization a machine or a living organism? And let me see if I can explain this to you. One of the goals of higher education, I've always firmly believed, is not only to try to teach you what to think about a particular topic, but also to help you to grow in your understanding and consideration of how to think. Again, not merely what to think in terms of content, but how to think in terms of thinking processes and critical analysis and all these kinds of topics. And so consider this for a moment. There was a point in time in behavioral psychology when the popular framework that many psychologists would offer up is that the mind is like a computer. The human mind is like a computer. And why did they say that? Because there is at least a kernel of truth to the fact that, like a computer, the human mind takes in inputs from the environment, right? By sense of sight, by sense of smell, sense of taste, touch, hearing. We take in inputs from the environment and then we respond. We output certain types of responses, whether it's we respond to something with something by saying something, or by doing something, or by thinking something. And so, like a computer, which takes in inputs from its keyboard or the network connection, right? And then it processes through these and comes out with outputs, there is a great deal of truth that in some ways, the human mind is like a computer. I hope that makes sense. You may have heard this before, right? But here's the interesting thing. If the primary framework that you use to study human beings and human behavior is the mind is like a computer, if that's your primary framework, then let me tell you that framework will automatically lead you to certain conclusions, and perhaps just as importantly, will automatically lead you away from reaching other conclusions that you might have considered if you had simply used a different framework to begin with. The famous French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal once said, "The heart knows reasons that reasons know nothing about." The heart knows reasons that reason knows nothing about. And even as I quote that, you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? If you have ever fallen madly in love with a person and you really don't have a rational explanation for that, I just adore her. You know exactly what Blaise Pascal meant when he said, the heart knows reasons that reason knows nothing about. This is a truth about human behavior, and yet that is a truth you will never reach if the only framework you're using to study human behavior is the human mind is like a computer. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, because as we consider different theories and different frameworks to think hard about management, just realize every single framework and theory that we propose will have some truth to it. It'll provide some level of analysis and insight for us to better understand how we manage. But mark my words, every theory and framework we introduce will not only automatically lead you to certain conclusions, it will also lead you away from considering other possible conclusions that you might have considered if you'd simply had used a different framework or theory to begin with. Now, I hope you understand, every single class you take, in the first couple of weeks, they're going to introduce to you new theories for you to use as a framework to study the topic. And one of the questions that you should keep in the back of your head is, I wonder what considerations on this topic I might have reached if we'd used a different theory to begin with. Again, just another way for you to think about these broad topics as we get started. Now, back to the slides. A question becomes then, if we're going to study history and theories, what is a theory? And you can see some of the points here on this slide. A theory is a conceptual framework for organizing knowledge and data and information and providing a blueprint for action. It's a way of thinking. And we have to acknowledge our ways of thinking define how we see our world. Our ways of thinking define how we see our own lives. And our ways of thinking, therefore, define why we do the things we do. What do I mean by that last bullet point? Well, what I mean is that everyone has reasons. Everyone generally makes sense to themselves most of the time. You have reasons for doing the things you do, and they make sense to you. You may not even always be able to explain them to other people, and yet inside your own heart and mind and motivations, the reasons made sense to you. Your friends may sometimes do things that surprise you, maybe even shock you or amaze you, and you can't understand why they did those things. But mark my words, even if you don't understand why, the reasons they did them, and even if they can't really fully explain to you the reasons why they chose to do the things they did, they make sense to themselves. And as we go back to the slide, you see, our ways of thinking define why we do the things that we do, our reasons. So let's consider. From the very earliest times that we have written human history, people have had their reasons. Specifically with regard to managing organizations, people from earliest ages of antiquity have tried to advance and understand better and evolve and develop better ways to manage organizations. You can see here the ancient Sumerians, about approximately 3000 BC, they were the first that we're aware of that used written rules and regulations to govern groups of people. The Egyptians used management practices to construct the pyramids. The Babylonians used extensive sets of laws and policies to govern their kingdoms. The Greeks used different governing systems for cities and states. The Romans used organized structure for communication and control. The Chinese used extensive organization structure for government agency and the arts. And quite frankly, you don't build an enormous wall that you can still see from space without some degree of efficient management. And you see the last thing there, the example there, the Venetians used organizational design and planning concepts to control the seas. Now, I will tell you, I am typically not a dates and names kind of guy, okay? I will rarely have dates and names you have to remember for an exam or a quiz. I rarely do that simply because it really doesn't impress anybody for you to be able to say, well, you know, I think the Sumerians were actually around at 3000 BC, not 2500 BC. Don't be that dude, right? Okay? So I rarely test on names and dates. And the whole purpose of this slide I have before you as we take a look at this slide is simply to suggest to you human beings have been thinking about management for a really, really, really long time. We have been thinking about and developing our thoughts on how to better manage organizations of people and resources for a very long time. And so when we get to the next slide to think about early Western thought during the Industrial Revolution, we can see here why, as we've begun to evolve and from all the way back generations ago, we get to 1776 and Adam Smith writes a seminal book called The Wealth of Nations, arguing for the division of labor or specialization as an increased way to bring more efficient productivity into free markets and therefore to lift entire nations' standard of living. And from there, you see a couple of other gentlemen there, Robert Owen, Charles Babbage, also significant thought during the days of the Industrial Revolution to really help us along the way of understanding, well, if now we have great big organizations and companies and even corporations to introduce products and services and bring them into the free marketplace, how might we do that more efficiently to get more performance out of our resources for human beings to be able to produce more and more goods and services to bring to market, all those kinds of things. This is the earliest days of Western thought. And where we will go to, as we will look at starting in the next lecture, is primarily all of this early management thought culminates in four large approaches to management. Four approaches that we have seen over the decades and generations that we've been thinking about management in our quote-unquote modern times. You see them here. The classical approach, the behavioral approach, systems approach, and the contingency approach. They will serve as categories for subsequent video lectures. So that's how we'll divide up this chapter and how we'll divide these video lectures up. And again, this is why we study history and theory, because we have much to learn from those who have come before us, and it helps us to shape our thinking as we consider how do we manage organizations. So, this is the conclusion of this short little video. Hopefully you should be able to explain why studying in theory and history is important and important to the actual practice of management, and at least trace some of the early major thought on management you've seen in the previous slides. Well, I hope that's helpful, just as we kick off our look at content from Chapter 2, the history and theory of thought on management into our modern times. Hope this was helpful. We will see you in the next lecture.